As all of you know, we record these sessions, and thanks to 3CSN, they're put into a repository. And so a lot of folks are watching these after the fact, and many of whom aren't able to attend. So that is one of the reasons that we record. But I just want to introduce myself for those of you who are joining for the very first time. I'm Patty Robinson. I am the Faculty Director of Civic and Community Engagement at College of the Canyons, and I'm joined by my two colleagues here that have been working with me in putting the series together. And I'd like Kimberly and Jan just to introduce themselves, please.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Kimberly Rosenfeld. I teach full-time at Cerritos Community College District in the Communication Studies Department, and I chair the Education Department. And I'm so happy to be co-collaborating with Patty Robinson and Jan Conlon on the civic engagement initiatives. And I'm going to use that in a plural form because this isn't the only one we're working on. So glad you're all here today. Jan?
Yes, hi everybody. I'm Jan Conlon, and I also am really thrilled that you're here with us. And we have a great speaker today, and we've had a series of great speakers. I represent 3CSN, the California Community College Success Network, because we love this topic, and we do have a YouTube channel, as mentioned, for seeing these again. So we're really happy to support and promote. So we're glad you're here. Thank you.
And I, again, just want to provide just a brief background of how the series got started. We're working on we're on our second Bringing Theory to Practice grant that started out looking at creating a civic engagement pathway between the California Community College system and the CSU system here in California. I know there are several people here today who are out of state, but because of that, and because of the relationship and the collaboration between our colleagues, this developed out of that first Bringing Theory to Practice grant. So it has been so successful. We're continuing it. We're already planning for fall, and hopefully we will be continuing this through spring of next year as well. And the way that this series is set up is that the first hour, we have our presenter. Our presenter will actually spend time talking about a particular topic, and then provide questions or an opportunity for folks to ask questions towards the end of the hour. You will have the opportunity to either put your question in the chat, or you certainly can unmute yourself as well. Then the second hour is followed by more of a deep dive where Kimberly, Jan, and I will meet with all of you who want to stay on. And Jen is going to be staying on today as well. And then we actually start to look at some of the issues that you found most interesting. And then we do a bit more of a deep dive in a discussion. So that is how it's set up. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jennifer Domagal-Goldman. And I'm going to refer to her as Jen because I had the distinct pleasure of meeting Jen I think it's been about 6 years ago. And as I said earlier in meeting Vertus Robinson, actually Jen was part of that group. And I met Jen along with Vertus, and like I said earlier, it was like an instant chemistry. It was like, oh my gosh, I have found my peeps. And so we have been able to keep in contact through the years. She is housed right now. I shouldn't say housed, but well, you are housed. You're literally in your house. But she is in Washington, D.C., and we're so pleased that she's here representing both Civic Nation and Allin Challenge. So just to give you a little bit of the information about Jen's background, Jen is the executive director of the Allin Campus Democracy Challenge at Civic Nation, again, located in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining the challenge, Jen was the director of the American Democracy Project, a national civic learning democratic engagement network of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, or what's better known as ASCU. Jen serves on the editorial board of the E-Journal of Public Affairs. She has contributed to a number of engagement publications, including co-authoring chapters in Reimagining Democratic Societies, a New Era of Personal and Social Responsibility, Becoming a Steward of Place, 4 Areas of Institutional Focus, and Student Outcomes in Service Learning, Conceptual Frameworks and Methods. She has also contributed to higher education's role in enacting a thriving democracy, civic learning, and democratic engagement theory of change, and has written various opinion pieces that have been published in Forbes and Fulcrum. Jen earned her PhD in higher education from Penn State. She received her MA in higher education in student affairs administration from the University of Vermont and her bachelor's degree from the University of Rochester. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jen, and thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Patty, and thank you, Jan and Kimberly and 3CSN and many of the community colleges in California for having me here today. It's so great to see so many familiar faces and names and some great friends and colleagues in the broader kind of higher education and civic engagement work across the country. I know we've got a few of the previous speakers and the upcoming speakers in the series joining us today, and it's so good to see folks. And Patty, thank you also for that, that wonderful and overly detailed introduction. You know, I'm gonna take just a second to do the usual awkward. I'm gonna share my screen and make sure you can see it. So hopefully you're seeing the title screen here. So we're gonna talk today a little bit about promoting democratic engagement on college campuses, or what I like to say is how to be all in for democracy. And I'm gonna spend, remember how to forward in this. There we go. I'm going to spend a little bit of time telling you a little bit more detail about the story, kind of my biography that brings me here to you today, and kind of flesh out a few details of what Patty just told you so that I can help kind of set the stage for telling you a little bit about something that we call the CLDE theory of change, which stands for civic learning and democratic engagement. And some of you who've been to the CLDE conferences that Patty referenced will be familiar with this. And I'm excited to be able to explore it with you all today. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the theory of change for the Allin Campus Democracy Challenge, where I work now, and what that leads us to in terms of how each of you and your institutions can be all in for democracy, what higher ed's role really in this work can be. And then obviously some Q&A and open discussion. I do hope that folks will, I'm gonna at a few different times kind of ask you some questions and ask you to think about some things. I really hope that you'll share some of your ideas in the chat. I also hope that you'll ask questions, and I will try to kind of pay attention to both. We're gonna be pretty informal, and we're in a pretty small group today, although I know we're also recording for hopefully other folks that are joining us virtually at a different moment. So I do wanna make sure that folks come away with their questions answered. So with that, I think, you know, the way that I've really organized how I think about the world has really been kind of with these kind of pieces of education and democracy as two of the lenses that I look at the world through. And that really started with my time in higher education. I've worked and attended, as you heard, a number of different institutions. I've worked at community colleges, public and private institutions. And my dissertation when I was at Penn State was really looking at how faculty learn to teach for civic capacities and engagement, and particularly align their kind of undergraduate disciplinary or field-based teaching and those kind of underlying purposes. And so this work has really brought me to the roles that Patty talked about. So through the American Democracy Project, which worked with public four-year institutions around the country, but through the conference that that group organized, really did a lot of thinking about what that looked like on all sorts of different campuses, including a whole cohort of community colleges that were part of what was called the Democracy Commitment. And I know that you heard from my colleague and friend, Bertus Robinson, in the fall, if you were to have joined that conversation. And so you're going to hear some different pieces that kind of pull that thread together throughout. But I first want to share two quotes with you that I think kind of capture that kind of commitment to thinking about education's role in our democracy and what that means. And the first is from an educational philosopher. The quote comes from John Dewey in 1916, and he says, "Democracy has been born anew, born anew in every generation, and education is its midwife." And many of you have probably heard that before, and really thinking about what that means. And I think particularly thinking about what that means in terms of what you've seen and experienced in this country in the last 6 months, in the last year, in the last 4 years, 5 years, you know, pick a period of time. what is the role of higher education in helping have democracy born anew? But also, what does that mean, right? And so this is a piece of a poem it's called Let America Be American, from Langston Hughes in 1935. And, I think the piece here really is that we've not really achieved the democracy we want, right? But we could build it together. We can form that more perfect union. We can think about advancing the kind of social justice, the equity and inclusion, and really having an informed and engaged community, civilization, however you want to frame that. And so, I think these two pieces really ground a lot of my thinking about how this work comes together. And so I hope that gives you kind of a beginning moment. When I finished my dissertation and was figuring out kind of what came next, my partner and I at the time moved to the DC area. He works for NASA and does a whole bunch of things to think about extrasolar planets. I tend to think a lot closer to home in terms of what we're doing now. And, I kind of was in the right place at the right time, and I became kind of the third person to help lead Askew's American Democracy Project. And I had been familiar with that project with Harry, who I quoted in my dissertation and who's on the call with us here today. As I had been a graduate student and then came on board and started, and I guess it must have been 2011 when I started with the American Democracy Project. And in 2012, a publication came out that some of you may have been familiar with. And if you've attended some of these other talks, you will have potentially heard Karen McTighe-Musil and other colleagues talk about a report from 2012 called A Crucible Moment. And so this CLDE theory of change really emerges from work done with colleagues at the institutions you see on the slide here. And I actually can give you a link in a minute to this publication, which is a series of essays and really an organizing theory for thinking about higher ed's role in our democracy and in achieving and enacting a thriving democracy. And so, it really builds on a lot of what was in that 2012 Crucible Moment report, which gathered a lot of information from a lot of different folks across higher education and this country, and really thought about what we were doing. And the fact that many of our students were showing up on campus with insufficient kind of civics knowledge, with insufficient experiences thinking about what it means for us to be a democracy, insufficient actual experiences engaging in it and having a sense of how to engage in change. And I know you've heard Harry talk about his thoughts on probably civic agency and public work and a lot of other great things. And that very much has been kind of on the outskirts of it, not necessarily for the longest time, especially in 2012, what most students were experiencing. And so this theory of change really says that we need to think about what a civic-minded campus would look like, what classrooms and learning experiences on a civic-minded campus would include, how we create a civic ethos on campus, and then what are the individual and collective capacities that we want all students to graduate with. What should they have when they finish, their associate's degree? What should they have when they finish a baccalaureate degree? What do we want from students when they, finish graduate degrees? What role beyond just student learning do we want institutions to play in their communities, whether that's, the local town or city or the county or the state, national, those kinds of things. And so you're seeing some of the those capacities kind of here that were outlined in that report, and that we really added the civic agency piece too, in large part with a lot of insight from Harry. And so want to share that. Also want to be clear that while I'm presenting all this information, this was a collective effort by a number of colleagues. And so want to make sure that that is really clear as well. So as part of this theory of change, we ask 4 major questions, and we're going to go in depth into these. And I'm also, at the end, I'm going to share my email address with you, and anyone who wants me to send them these slides or that I can share broader information with, I'm more than happy to. Please don't frantically take notes because I'm happy to share the slides. But we really say that there's 4 kind of questions we want folks to think about: the vision question, the learning question, the pedagogy question, and the strategy question. And I think each of these are important in different ways. And we're going to talk about them. I'm going to suggest some potential answers to some of these questions. But I really want to underscore that they're kind of big, like 30,000 view answers to the questions that I then need each of you to answer for yourself. What would it mean in your own work, whether it's in your own classroom, it's in your own set of programs, it's in the way that you're kind of enacting relationships and other things in like different communities that you are part of. So we're going to explore that framework a little bit. And so this first question, the vision question, which is really about purpose, is what are the key features of the thriving democracy we aspire to enact and support through our work? So what would that thriving democracy look like? And how would it be different than what you're experiencing now? What would it look different? You know, have we talked about this? Do we talk about the civic purposes of higher education as part of our coursework? You know, are we talking about this with students? What might that be different depending on if you are teaching communications or education like Kimberly, or are a college president like Bill has been? You know, what would this really look like? And so I'm going to share 2 slides that have some potential answers to this, but again, they're kind of those 30,000 foot piece, and we're really thinking about what are the values that we want to be enacted in our lives, in our institutions, in the way we do our work. And so I want to share these with you, but while I'm sharing them, I'm really hoping, I'm not sure I can see the chat at the same time that I'm presenting my slides, but I'm hoping you will start to answer this question with things that you're thinking in the chat. And again, I'm not going to read each of these to you, but we tried to bring them back to like very basic principles. So what you're not seeing here is the word reciprocity, or the word social justice, or the word so other things, some other values that I absolutely think are part of a thriving democracy. We tried to pull it back one more layer to say, what are these different very basic values that we need to have be a piece of this? So I would urge you to think about, are the values that your campus says that it holds as part of its, you know, campus pillars or mission statement or other document, how are they related to the values of advancing a more thriving democracy, right? What does that look like? And so here are these different pieces, and I think many of them, you know, you can kind of work into that, right? And I think one of them for me is really thinking about, you know, what does civic courage look like? What does full participation in our society and our communities look like? Who often isn't part of that conversation? How are we having conversations in new and different ways? And so really thinking about, you know, is your campus and classroom, you know, is it representative of different democratic values in different ways? You know, what does that mean as we go along for these other questions in terms of what learning outcomes and pedagogy and strategies we want to put in place? And I think, you know, I think it's a really interesting question to ask. And again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time diving in here, but I hope you'll share some of the values that you would say a thriving democracy would hold. I would also hope it's a little bit less partisan than we are right now. I would hope that it's a little more information and fact-based. And, you know, I think there are a lot of other things that you can pull from that, but we also tried to bring it back, I think, to those like primary principles. So the second question is the learning outcomes question. And that's really asking, what are the knowledge, the skills, the dispositions? I would add the experiences that we want people to have. You know, what do they need to have in order to help create and contribute to this thriving democracy, right? And I really think we constantly have to really think about reframing what democracy means to us, and, you know, what it means to be politically engaged, what it means, you know, what we're really talking about. And so again, we'll offer some ideas here that are kind of, again, some of these big picture ideas, but want you to think about what it would mean for you. What are the knowledge, skills, and dispositions that you're asking graduates in the classrooms and the coursework that you're part of? What are you asking them to think about? How are we preparing teachers? I have a second grader, right? How are we preparing teachers to think about this work in their K-12 classrooms? You know, how are we making sure they're prepared to think about this? And I think, you know, taking time to reflect on that can be really important. So we talk about a couple of different ones, and I know you've heard some about civic agency, I think from Harry, if you've joined before. I think part of this is like, do we have basic ideas about how our world works, but then not just how it works, but how it could be. I'd love to tell a story about my daughter when she was in preschool. They had an election during the 2016 election, and she was 3, and they actually voted between pony rides and a magic. And they had to make posters of what they thought would be the best one. And then there was a parent who had some sort of vendor company, and they agreed on the following Monday to come in and either give the students a magic show or pony ride. And, it was really cute. And my 3-year-old daughter desperately wanted the pony rides and did not think the magic show sounded very fun. Some of the older kids, were making arguments that the magic show would mean everyone got to experience a whole big thing, versus if you were doing the pony rides, it would be an individual experience, like once around the circle. But they went through a whole process. They had to make like a little registration card, right, and turn it in. And they got their ballot and had a picture and the word, and they had to go in and write it down and fold it up and stick it in a ballot box. And then they publicly counted those ballots. And she came home desperately excited that pony rides had won. I looked at that and thought, what an amazing way to teach how this process works. Also, I hope by the time she's eligible to vote, that we won't have a registration process like she had to go through for that. We should be enacting automatic voter registration, right? It should be part and parcel. We already know who's 18 and who's a citizen. This should be automatic. Now, I will also say I live in the first place in the country to allow both non-citizens and 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in municipal elections. So I'm a little bit of a voting advocate. But I think it's those pieces. It's understanding how it works, but it's understanding how you can change it and why we would need to change it, right? And understanding how to cultivate those skills of being able to organize and talk with people and understand how things connect. And sometimes we very much silo knowledge. We get students who only study, this discipline or study this discipline, and how are we connecting them? And so I think really thinking about some of these potential learning outcomes that you want students to take away, and really also that application of what they're learning to current events, I think can't be, emphasized enough. So with that, what would the pedagogy look like? How do we best foster the acquisition and development of those outcomes that we want? And I think often we think about that and we say, well, we should use engaged pedagogy, or we should do service learning, or we should do discussion-based whatever. Those are all great options for pedagogy. I want you to take it a step back and think about what else happens. Learning doesn't only happen in the classroom. One of the really sad things about this last year of all of us needing to socially isolate is we're not having those same informal conversations in the hallway outside our offices, or the same conversations with students who come to office hours, or the same conversations when one of the student organizations meet up, or we're in the cafeteria, or whatever those places might be. The learning's happening there too, right? And so how are you connecting that? How are we thinking about those pieces? And so I really want you to think about, how are we pedagogically engaging different ideas in the entire institution and potentially beyond, right? How are we thinking about what the teacher education students might be doing, and how are we giving them chances to do reflection when they're teaching in the classroom with, when they're doing their student teaching, I guess is the word I want, right? And so I think, there's a number of things you want to think about here, right? How do we let them know that we're not the experts all the time? Sometimes we don't know the answer, or sometimes there's not an answer. How do we hold the fact that there's a continuum at times, and it's not just black and white? How are we talking about and using inclusive and empowering language, right? How many times have you read something in the Chronicle or read about somebody, some faculty member saying something awful, or some student saying something awful to another student? How are we respecting and engaging with each other in really meaningful conversations? And I think that that's really important. And I think the pedagogy comes from everywhere. What's an institutional president framing as the work of the campus? How is that part of a convocation or a graduation ceremony? What are the things we're saying we value, right? And I think that's a piece of what it comes down to for me. And I'm going a little bit quickly because I want to get to some of the other pieces, but finally, it's that piece. It's the strategy. How are we building institutional culture, infrastructure, and the relationships to do this, to support this learning, to support the pedagogy? I think having something like this series is a strategy for engaging in this, is pedagogy for engaging in this, right? The fact that you're going to hear from me today, but then we're not all just going to go our merry way, hopefully, but engage in some conversation where we can hear what great ideas Susan's jotting down as I'm talking, right? And we can hear like what led to the sparkle behind Harry's eyes as he heard me say something, right? Like, I know that you all have as much to contribute, if not more, to this conversation right now that I'm giving you. And so how do we do that in a bigger picture? How are we providing the professional development? You know, we're often not taught to teach when we go through doctoral programs, right? How, let alone taught to think about the broader kind of civic capacities that we want to have as a country. But if it's not higher education's role, who's going to do it? You know, so many community colleges were talked about, and Harry and others have written about this as democracy's colleges, right? We gave access and continue to give access to students who haven't had it before. You know, there are communities that would barely be on the map if the community college didn't exist there. We are some of that important infrastructure of the democracy. And so how do we continue to build it? How are we living the principles and values and mission statements we say we have? And what is each of our roles in showing up for that? So I think, you know, I think that's really exciting. I will just say that there are things you're doing that are part of that civic work that are some of these democratic threads in your institutions that you're not thinking about as being this. And I'd really hope that you'll think about what that means, right? That you'll think about the fact that you're doing this series as a piece of that work. That some of the other things you've done after hearing some of my fellow colleagues speaking has been a piece of that. You know, and that there's a lot of kind of bigger picture things, and that if we can see how they connect and if we can help students see how they connect, we're empowering kind of that next generation. You know, one of my favorite programs to talk about in California has been the public sphere pedagogy work coming out of Chico State and Butte Community College and some others. If you haven't looked at it, I'd really encourage you to think about it. But, you know, they've created some of these kind of required courses, you know, one's around, it's called like the Great Debate, right? It's a communications course. And there's another one called Town Hall Meeting. And it's giving students the opportunity to pick an issue and to look at it from different angles and to share it with the community and to really think about it. And all of the assessment of those courses is saying that those students are graduating in higher numbers. So they're being more successful. Those numbers are even better for the first generation students and the students of color who often are considered at greater risk of not completing college in the 4 to 6 years that we expect them to. They're also in qualitative reports saying they feel a higher sense of civic agency, of efficacy, of their ability to kind of interact in a community and make change. And those are the kind of strategies we want to put in place, right? Not just the small groups that maybe already choose to do this work, that are political science majors or choose to be part of student government or have the time to do that, but how do we assume and make sure that all students have this ability? So that's the first part, and we're on really good time here. I hope, and I know I can see that there's a bunch of chats, and so I wonder, before I move to this next piece, Patty, if there's anything, but I really can't see them while I share my slides. Like, I can see the little bubble. Is there anything that anyone wants to raise or ask before we move to the next part?
Actually, so far they're comments, not specific questions. So maybe if folks have very specific questions, if you want to go ahead and put them in the chat, and then we will be monitoring them as Jen continues on with her next part of her presentation.
How many of you, I need to find my piece of paper here, hold on. How many of you know what California AB 963 says? Patty does. Patty also made sure I was going to talk about it as part of my thing. Does anyone else know what California AB 963 is? I see a comment. Hold on. Let me see if I can see that. Nope. No. Excellent. So that's going to be my next slide here. So in October of 2019, and I hope you can see the whole slide because all of the little things hover over it for me. So is the Student Civic and Voter Empowerment Act. And California, to my knowledge, is the first state to pass something like this. I will say And my state of Maryland, because I live just outside of DC, has the House of Delegates just passed a similar bill. Ours is called something like College Student and Veteran Voter Engagement Act or something like that. But it hasn't passed our Senate yet, and it was also proposed last year and passed the House and didn't pass the Senate, so we'll hold our breath. But this Empowerment Act that was championed by a number of different organizations, including an organization that really was started in California called a Band of Voters, requires that the public institutions in California, including each of the community colleges that many of you are part of, to do a set of things. And I'm going to tell you about these things a little bit, and then hopefully have you understand why the way that the Allin Campus Democracy Challenge that I'm going to talk about and that I lead right now is a great way to help you do these things. So this act also does provide some funding, but it requires each campus to nominate or to designate, I guess is a better word, a civic and voter empowerment coordinator. Patty serves as that person at College of the Canyons. That person has to help the campus lead a civic engagement education campaign and develop a civic, I can't see this word, I'm pretty sure it says voter. Hold on. Civic and voter empowerment action plan that's specific to the campus. The campuses have to work with the Secretary of State to send campus-wide emails, and there's a whole bunch of requirements about what those campus-wide emails have to contain around voting information. They also have to disseminate civic-related dates and information through campus social media and organize at least 3 events each academic calendar year that focus on this work. I will also say California is a great place to be a voter. So you may have been following the news. You may have seen that Georgia's Governor Kemp just signed into law a whole array of truly terrible voter restriction laws, including the fact that you aren't allowed to pass water and food out to people waiting in lines to vote in Georgia, even though some of them took 8 hours in 2020. Some groups have already filed some lawsuits saying that they are not constitutional and they violate the Voter Rights Act. I think many of them are likely to be found as such, at least by some lower federal courts. We will see what will happen at the Supreme Court if it makes it that far. So there's a lot of interesting things going on around voting, but California is really trying to do the right thing. And, you know, I think this is important. We can't vote till we're 18 in most places. Oftentimes then we are not necessarily at home or in the same voting precinct that we might have voted before. We often, even if we are taught how to vote or we are pre-registered to vote when we're in high school, don't realize and aren't taught about how to change that when we move, and even taught that we need to change it every time we move, even if it's down the street. So there are a lot of things that are missing in this piece. You know, part of my work when I was at the American Democracy Project and creating the theory of change was really thinking about how do we do faculty development, how do we think about institutional responsibility, you know, how do we do these different pieces. And when the Allin Campus Democracy Challenge, which I'm going to talk about next, was founded in 2016 at Civic Nation, which is a not-for-profit 501c3. Both are nonpartisan, both are nonprofit efforts. So we're celebrating right now our 5th anniversary. When they launched, when I was at ADP, we were one of the first partner organizations. And so we did a lot of work to encourage campuses to participate in this work, because we realized that while we've been focused on democracy this whole time, many campuses weren't talking about political and voter engagement because it didn't feel safe, particularly public campuses. I think it feels more safe in California at times because of the state level politics, but a lot of times, you know, voting more and more and voting rights and voting access and education has started to be construed as something that big D Democrats value, not just those of us who are in our democracy. And it's become very partisan to talk about voting in a lot of spaces. It isn't in and of itself and shouldn't be when we are talking about helping students to vote. And it's actually required by federal law. So colleges and universities through the Higher Education Act are required to provide voter information and access to registering as part of their work. And there's a lot of different ways that comes about. California's bill law takes it to kind of another step. And I think what's interesting is the way that Allin was set up and the way we do our work really leads to that. So I should just make sure to mention it's also a free program, but I became really engaged in this work when I was still at Allin and was one of their founding advisory board members. And then eventually, you know, part of me personally got to the point where I was like, we can keep talking about civic purpose and public problem solving, but if we can't have a democracy where everyone's vote is counting and one in which the electorate's actually matching our country's diversity, then I'm doing the icing and not the work. And so I really felt like I wanted to go back and really think about what political engagement and how we're teaching students to think about organizing and advocating for the work they wanted to do, and voting in and of itself were being realized, and what higher ed's role in that is. And so I will just say that we're really focused on fostering civic culture and institutionalizing democratic engagement work. We work now with more than 800 colleges and universities in 49 states, plus the District of Columbia. If anyone knows somebody in Wyoming, let me know. There are fewer campuses there, and we're just not yet there. But we are also working with more than 60 institutions in California, including about 25 community colleges. We do define democratic engagement as being three pieces. So civic learning, political engagement, and voter participation. We've definitely leaned in harder on some of the voter participation work in the last 4 years. I think for some obvious reasons, but also because we've had the data for the first time, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. I want to show you a little bit of our theory of change and tell you that our work really is to create a more engaged and inclusive democracy, and we really want that to be representative of the diversity that exists. We also know that voting is a habit. It's a kind of a muscle that needs to be developed, and once somebody votes for the first time, they're much more likely to vote again. We also know that college students are often some of the people that are able to vote for the first time. But I will say even the other students, you know, we talk about students that right now aren't all, especially community colleges, 18 to 22 years old. Often the other students, the adult students, are often first-time college students. Many of them vote at lower numbers as well. And so, you know, this work has really been intentional in doing that. We do our work in three buckets. We talk about structure, support, and recognition. So we give out annual awards that are based on actual voter registration and turnout data that campuses can get. And again, we're going to talk about that in a moment. But we do that by providing an entire structure. So we ask campuses to make a public commitment. We ask them to develop a comprehensive action plan, and we provide a lot of ways to do that. And so you hear that action plan that these coordinators in California are being asked to put into practice. We have a whole structure and whole set of resources for how to build those plans. In fact, we give feedback on the plans. We do a lot of trainings, and the plans are publicly available on our website, so you can look at peer institutions and see what they're doing, and have conversations with folks and think about how we move the needle next. But we very much believe that doing this work and continuing to pay attention to continuous improvement around that, and we raise up kind of best practices and a lot of the research in this space, will lead to higher student engagement, higher levels of institutional engagement of these institutions thinking about how they're enacting democracy and the framework we talked about before. We're also helping build a broader national network that includes many of the folks who've been part of the speaker series so far. And so it's been really exciting to do a lot of this work. We do this work with a team of 6 and then a whole dedicated crew of interns who more and more are remote. So if you have students who would like to be doing this work with us, you should let me know. In fact, and I can only see a couple of you at a time, but Vera, who's been on the call, was actually an intern that worked a while ago, many years ago, that worked with me and some colleagues when I was at the American Democracy Project and helped us organize one of the conferences. So again, really great to see folks here. So as we do that work, you know, we're really trying to make sure that students are engaged not only in elections, but in an ongoing basis between elections. So this isn't an off year for us. We are both engaged in helping students in New Jersey and Virginia that have state level work. We are engaged in helping students understand a lot of the legislation that is pending now in terms of helping them think about what issues their state legislatures might be looking at that might concern them. And we do all of this in a very nonpartisan way, but that doesn't mean students themselves don't have partisan beliefs, right? But they need to know how they enact that. And so we have a whole set of different resources. Again, this is a really quick glimpse of what we ask campuses to do. We also really encourage them as they're creating these action plans to not just have the coordinator, not just have their PADI, right? They need to have a whole coalition of folks doing this work. And often the folks who need to be part of that coalition are already there on the ground. They're students who might be part of one of your student PERGs, or it might be your SGA or another student group. You'll have, political science faculty super engaged, or, often faculty in different professional fields are often paying a lot of attention to this work. And then you see this acronym for the first time, which says NSLVE, and we say that word as NSOLVE. I'm pretty sure that's, oh no, I have one more slide before that. But I just want to tell you, I'm going to back up, I'll let you read this while I do that. Part of the reason Allin was created in 2016 is that for the first time, right before then, colleges and universities across the country could access their voter registration and turnout data for their campus. Voter rolls are public. We don't know how any one of us voted, but I can look up and find out if any one of you voted in an election if I wanted to, right? And there's a whole way of doing that. And it can be complicated depending on the state and locality, but it's public record. There are companies that collate all of that information, and then that's bought by campaigns, but also by a lot of political science researchers. What is happening at an organization called the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education, which is at Tufts University outside Boston, is they are purchasing that list. They're working with campuses to have permission to have that list matched against the data, the student data that they provide to something called the National Student Clearinghouse. They send the list to the clearinghouse. The clearinghouse de-identifies all of that information and spits out a report. That report then tells your campus how many of your students are registered, how many of your students are voting. It breaks it down by different demographics, depending on what your campus reports to the clearinghouse. So it may break it down by race, by age, by class year, gender, area of study, based on some federal, so it's not perfect to your majors, it's like some federal designations, but you'll get like education majors or business or science or those kinds of things. And it's not telling you just the students who are voting in your state, right? So if you're an institution that has students all over the country, it's telling you all of that information, right? It's also giving you some data about the method by which they're voting. So did they vote by mail, absentee, same day, different things like that. The efficacy of that data kind of depends on how the states report that data. And I think the data this year will be a little confusing given a lot of the changes that took place due to COVID. But those reports come out about 9 months, actually about 10 months after the election. So we'll get the 2020 data in September. But we ask campuses to do their plans based on that data, right? So if you know that you have lower voter turnout in your school of business, you should be talking to business faculty and students, right? If you know that, your first year students are voting at lower rates than your seniors, which is what the national average tells us, how do you build this into orientation, right? And what I will say is, we've done some external evaluation of our program, and campuses that are participating with us, including the structure, are having an average of 2.2 percentage points higher voter turnout than campuses that aren't. And so that doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is. And so I think, paying attention to this work and really thinking about it. And I'm really going to be excited because 2020 will be the first election that some of this was put into place in California, to really see what those numbers start to look like, especially compared to 2016. So this is the slide about the National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement. You see kind of a screenshot of one of the pages in the report would look like. So it will compare, this year it'll compare the 2020 election to 2016, give you a lot of different senses. It's all FERPA compliant. The lawyers have all signed off on it, all of these different things. But we, as part of our, I told you earlier, we do structure, support, and recognition. We will give out a whole set of awards around this work this fall. And really, in doing so, are trying to get your campus leaders to pay more attention to this work, right? To say, Patty can't be the only one at College of the Canyons doing this work. How are we making sure she has the resources to execute this plan, right? How are we telling other people they should be valuing this work too, and that it matters? That said, this is just one way that we can compare apples to apples on campuses, which is partly why we've leaned in harder in the space, but the civic learning and the political engagement outside of elections are just as important. And that's partly why I wanted to share the CLD theory of change earlier. and we're going to end in just a second. So just a little bit about coalitions. We asked that they have a whole bunch of different stakeholders in the work, and that they are part of building those action plans and executing them. We have a whole guide in terms of how to build that. It has 9 sections and a rubric that goes with it. We give a sense of how we actually confidentially score the action plans and give recommendations for improvement. So we're asking you for everything from strategy in terms of how you're going to do registration, education, and turnout to, where's your leadership on this and what kind of commitment does the institution have? Have you done like a landscape analysis of what's happening? Are you using your NSOLV data to build on this? How are you going to report and evaluate this information? So it should be to the point that other students on campus know what their voting rates are and know how to do this work, and don't have to rebuild it every cycle. We do these on a kind of a 2-year basis. I'm really going to go through just these a little bit quickly because I want to make more time for questions. And we have a whole set of deadlines. So we actually, on March 30th, for those of you who might be interested, are doing a 2020 action plan deep dive, and then a look ahead for 2022. Our early deadline for 2022 campus plans is in December. But this will provide a lot of the data in terms of the 520 campuses that did action plans for 2020 and what we found in those. We also have a website called allintovote.org, which is a free tool to register to vote, to find information about candidates, to understand the Electoral College. We do a number of other kind of events that are free and support our campuses. I will tell you, Allin to Vote is less important for those of you who have voters in California, because your Secretary of State has been amazing and they have a great website. That's not true for other states. And if you have students who need to vote in a different state, our tool will be really helpful to you. You can follow us on social media, and I would encourage you to do that. Our handle is Allin to Vote. And then we're going to be doing our award ceremony entirely virtually this year. And I know Patty has come, I'm pretty sure, before, although, right? Yep, she's nodding. So we're going to do it between the 8th and the 12th of November. And partly that is because we won't have the voter data till the end of September. And we will be doing a whole set of engagement, including action planning webinars as part of that work. We'll also let you know that there are some other things kind of coming up. If you're not aware, we're right now celebrating the 50th anniversary of the 26th Amendment. And that's the amendment that gave the right to 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. The right to vote was passed in 1970 amidst the Vietnam War, when we were sending 18-year-olds basically off to die, and yet they didn't have a right to vote in the policies we had. And then there's a whole set of different civic holidays, we call them, in the early fall, that really can be part of those action plans. So everything from Constitution Day on the 17th, National Voter Registration Day, Vote Early Day. So a number of things here. And again, I can share these pieces with you. So going to end there and take any questions. And I know we have probably a few minutes